History is often an epic written by the victors, yet its greatest secrets lie hidden in the silence of what never happened. On the morning of October 24th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange opened with its usual ambitious and chaotic energy. The echoing footsteps in the narrow streets of Wall Street were not heralds of an approaching apocalypse. In this parallel universe, the great earthquake we read about in dusty history books never occurred. The infamous wave of destruction known as Black Thursday never reached the doors of the exchange. Stock prices did not collapse and ticker machines did not jam to report catastrophic losses. The familiar expression of terror on investors' faces was replaced by the calm of an ordinary business day. The desperate and furious crowds that gathered overnight in front of banks never formed. The financial black hole that swallowed billions in a single day never opened. The Great Depression, modern history's deepest trauma, remained nothing more than a possibility. Let us imagine that mysterious world in which history's greatest domino never fell. If the crisis of 1929 had never happened, the 20th century would tell an entirely different story. Political maps would be drawn not in blood, but in the golden ink of uninterrupted prosperity. The darkest fruits of the crisis, ideologies of hatred, would have found no soil of poverty in which to grow. Consider Germany, waiting like a wounded giant at the heart of Europe. By the late 1920s, the Weimar Republic had begun to stand again and breathe. In a Berlin where unemployment never soared to 30%, radical voices would have struggled to find an audience. The days when people carried wheelbarrows full of money to buy a single loaf of bread would never have arrived. In such a world, dark figures like Adolf Hitler would never have found the fertile ground of anger needed to manipulate the masses. Nazism might have remained a marginal footnote, confined to beer halls and quickly forgotten. This would not merely mean the absence of one party's rise, it would mean the non-existence of the greatest atrocity in history. World War II, Europe's 1,000-year-old libraries would not burn. Ancient cities would not turn to ash beneath aerial bombardment. The Holocaust would never scar the human spirit with irreparable wounds. Scientific genius would be devoted not to strengthening tank armor, but to advancing humanity. Scientists would learn to split the atom, not to erase cities from maps, but to illuminate the world without limit. The expansionist ambitions of the Soviet Union might have faded early against the unshakable wall of a stable Europe. The Cold War, with its 50 years of nuclear dread, might never have cast its frozen shadow. Instead of a bipolar empire of fear, the world could have become a vast marketplace bound together by trade. The United States might have remained a commercial giant without assuming the role of world policeman. The British Empire would not have collapsed under the crushing debts of war. Decolonization might have unfolded through balanced economic agreements rather than bloody conflicts. The fragile borders of the Middle East would not have been hastily drawn at war tables through secret deals. Humanity would not have sacrificed decades to rebuilding shattered cities in the 1940s. Instead, it might have directed its energy toward reaching Mars in the 1950s, or exploring the deepest oceans. The sharp, bloody divide between capitalism and socialism could have softened upon a foundation of shared prosperity. The working class, instead of revolting in desperation, might have entered the middle class far earlier. Trade unions would have focused not on survival, but on improving quality of life. Governments would have remained service partners rather than saviors. The absence of the 1929 crisis would have preserved not only bank accounts, but the dignity and futures of millions. The social melancholy that infused art with despair would never have taken hold. Cinema, literature, and music would reflect technological optimism instead of the philosophy of a lost generation. The dazzling spirit of the Jazz Age would never have bowed to the grey silence of the 1930s. Art Deco architecture would have continued erecting monumental cities across the globe without interruption. Education systems, nourished by wealth, might have evolved beyond what we can imagine today. Universities would have secured limitless funding for fundamental research rather than weapons development. Medical research would not have been interrupted by war budgets. Diseases that still haunt us might have been defeated decades earlier. The brightest minds would not have been lost in trenches, but gained in laboratories. Yet such relentless acceleration would carry hidden dangers. Unchecked growth might have deepened the illusion of infinite resources. Environmental awareness could have awakened too late in a world intoxicated by prosperity. Financial systems, convinced of their own invincibility, might have succumbed to dangerous hubris. Without the harsh lesson of collapse, structural cracks would have remained invisible, until perhaps a far greater reckoning arrived. And still, for the ordinary person on the street, the world would have felt easier and safer. Breadlines would have been replaced by debates over which luxury automobile was superior. The drums of war would have given way to the cheerful ring of stock exchange bells. Humanity might have entered the longest uninterrupted era of peace in its history. This radiant world, however, would have been built upon an absence. The crisis never came, but neither did the awakening it forced upon us. And so, we are left to wonder, was the catastrophe a tragedy alone, or also a brutal teacher that shaped the world we know? When economic miracles appear destined to last forever, the greatest danger is already at the door. Because mathematics always collects its price in the end. Since the Great Cleansing of 1929 never occurred, the world drifted through the 1930s and 1940s in unstoppable arrogance and fabricated wealth. In a world where governments felt no need to intervene, unregulated banking and reckless speculation spread through the system's veins like a growing poison. Banks took greater risks each day, distributing loans that could never be repaid, constructing a virtual paradise on borrowed illusions. The small bubble that did not burst in 1929 had, by the 1950s, become a planetary bomb. In a system devoid of regulation, corporations inflated their paper values and created a financial universe detached from real production. While humanity planned commercial stations on the moon, the economic fault lines beneath the earth tightened second by second. Technology had advanced so far that people began to believe crises were merely primitive myths of the past. But by the late 1950s, grains of sand within the gears began to grind. The first crack did not come from distant shores, but from the most trusted pillar of the system, the deflation of a colossal real estate bubble. One morning, people awoke to discover that their million-dollar property certificates were worth nothing. Sell orders flooded the screens with a violence far greater than the imagined scenario of 1929. This time, however, the system was so deeply integrated that the collapse of a single bank felt like the power grid of entire continents shutting down. The decade of debt unpaid in 1929 returned, with 30 years of accumulated interest knocking at the door. A civilization at the height of technological achievement found itself within weeks staring into the darkness of a new Middle Age. Governments did not know how to respond. For 30 years they had forgotten how to intervene in markets. Social security systems and relief funds had never been built, leaving millions utterly unprotected. Factories halted as credit lines for raw materials evaporated in seconds. The small suffering avoided in 1929 had returned as a global leviathan. Scientists cancelled Mars projects and instead drafted pamphlets teaching citizens how to grow potatoes. This was not merely the collapse of currency. It was the bankruptcy of a belief system and an entire way of life. A generation raised on perpetual growth could not psychologically withstand the sudden fall. Social order unraveled so rapidly that governments declared martial law. Intercity trade froze and regions turned inward, struggling to survive. Humanity finally understood that crises were not just disasters but painful medicines necessary for systemic survival. By refusing the medicine in 1929, the illness had become terminal. Had the small tremor occurred then, this colossal devastation might never have happened. but hubris and greed had blinded the world for 3 decades. As currencies became less valuable than scraps of paper, barter returned. Gold and silver once again became the only trusted stores of value, yet they were nearly impossible to find. The Super Depression tested not only economies but morality itself. Neighbors turned against one another for food. Great cities became centers of chaos. The purest and wildest form of unrestrained capitalism had finally devoured itself. Reconstruction would not take a few years, as in the 1930s, but an entire generation's lifetime. Humanity had to relearn survival and restraint, forgetting luxury and infinite growth. Modern civilization would wait long before regaining its former brilliance. The postponed cost of 1929 had turned the world into a ghost town. Yet from the darkness, a new understanding began to emerge. People realized that infinite growth was an illusion, and that balance mattered more than expansion. New economic systems were built upon trust and oversight. But the price of this lesson had been millions of lives and 30 lost years. History once again proved that nothing in nature or economics comes free. If you avoid a crisis, you merely postpone your appointment with a larger one. That parallel world without 1929 ultimately faced its own apocalypse. The windows of Art Deco towers stood shattered, their grand avenues silent. The glittering jazz melodies were replaced by the harsh wind of survival. Yet humanity, as always, would attempt to rise from its ashes, this time humbler, more cautious, more vigilant. A generation that once dreamed of reaching the moon, now dug into the soil with bare hands, trying to grow food. This story reminds us that crises are not merely catastrophes, they are warnings. Had the warning of 1929 been heeded, the fall might not have been so brutal. But history is written not in what-ifs, but in what happens. And in that parallel universe, what happened was total collapse. In our own world, every crisis we endure may be shielding us from something far worse. Small tremors release the energy of greater earthquakes. Small crises prevent monumental collapse. The world without 1929 teaches us, painfully, how precious systemic resilience truly is. Civilization is not defined solely by technology or money, but by the ability to manage crises. Any society that fails to learn this skill is destined sooner or later to vanish from the stage of history. It is time to leave the dark streets of that parallel universe and return to our own. We may face crises and endless challenges, but at least we know how to repair the system. The experience born from the ashes of 1929 remains our greatest capital. We must never forget these dusty pages of history, for financial history does not only recount the past, it whispers of possible futures. If we learn to listen, those whispers may protect us from the next super depression. The world without 1929 should remain in our minds as a cautionary tale. Every rise has an end. Every night gives way to morning. How bright that morning will be depends on the lessons we choose today. Economics is not merely numbers. It is psychology and history intertwined. This story ends here, but its lessons endure. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as small disasters, protecting us from greater ruin. Perhaps it is time to see the crisis of 1929 not only as a catastrophe, but as a reluctant savior. Without it, there might not even be a world left to tell this story. Such is history's irony, pain is often the greatest teacher. And in 1929, humanity learned that lesson the hard way. Now it is our turn to carry that wisdom forward, toward a world where crises are not eliminated, but wisely managed. Until the next journey into the mysterious depths of financial history, take care of yourselves and of your economy.